Welcome back everybody. So our last video was titled Introduction to Tourism and it addressed these 5 questions. So if you can't answer these questions, you'll need to go back to the Introduction to Tourism video and have a look to make sure that you understand these 5 questions. What is tourism? What are the different types of tourism? What is a tourist attraction? How are tourist attractions categorised and why is it important to understand tourism? So this video is focused on the history of tourism and we're focusing on the broad question of how has tourism changed. And I think it's important to ask ourselves the question, have humans always wanted to travel? Have they always had the desire to move about for entertainment and for seeking knowledge of other places? So to address this broad question of how has tourism changed, we need to look at the 4 distinct periods that we can look at, the different types of tourism. So the first time period that we'll look at is ancient tourism. The next that we'll look at is classical tourism, and that time period runs from BC 600 to AD 600. Then we'll look at some of the 19th century developments that allowed tourism to change into modern tourism, and then we'll look at contemporary or current tourism. So the first time period that we are going to look at is the ancient time period, and we're going to just have a quick little look at the kind of tourism that was undertaken during the ancient time period. So tourism or travel for fun can be traced right back to the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks. So the ancient Egyptians travelled to the steep periods of Saqqara, which are pictured here. They visited the Sphinx and they visited the Great Pyramids of Giza. So these 3 features are actually one of the most visited tourist attractions in the world today, and these structures were actually a prime example of a tourist attraction right back in ancient times. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs would often visit these 3 structures. If we look back at ancient Greece as well, they also undertook something similar to tourism today, in that they actually travelled to visit and watch the Olympic Games. Okay, so those games were not as we know them today, but that's what our games are modelled on. They had events such as chariot racing, pictured here, and many people from all over ancient Greece would travel to view the Olympic Games, which is something that we also do today. We also have travel writing, so if anybody's looked at like Lonely Planet guides or anything, that's what travel writing is, and that began right back with Herodotus in 485 BC. So he visited Egypt, North Africa, the Black Sea, Mesopotamia and Italy, and this here is a map that Herodotus created on his travels during his lifetime. So he not only travelled to see the world, but he travelled to contribute some knowledge about what the world was like and translated that knowledge through the creation of maps and also of several documents that communicated his findings about other parts of the area in which he lived. So the next time period that we're going to have a look is the classical time period, and that time period runs from BC 600 to AD 600. So travel and tourism continued into the classical time period, and that was thanks to the development of early road networks. So Romans were well known for their well-developed road network, and you can see here all the red lines are the roads in which the Romans developed during this time period, and the saying that all roads lead to Rome came from this road network, because as you can see, you could follow any of these road networks and eventually you would make your way down to Rome. So during this time period, travel and tourism was undertaken mostly by wealthy people who were seeking fun. And it was in this time period that the idea of seaside resorts were popular with Romans. So if you picture sitting on the beach, enjoying the sun, that sort of travel was pioneered by the Romans during the classical time period. They also developed the idea of spa holidays. So these days, a lot of people go on holidays and they go to the spa, they have massages, facials, go into the saunas, and that idea started with the Romans during the classical period. So they would go to luxurious thermal baths across Italy and around Europe, and they took that sort of relaxation one step further, and people would often go on holidays to partake in gambling and prostitution. So they definitely pioneered the idea of having a relaxing holiday. So if we move into the 16th century, we really start to see the beginning of modern tourism. So wealthy people, again, would be the people who would partake in tourism, and basically young men or women, but mainly men, would take what was known as the Grand Tour of Europe. Now, this tour would last between 1 and 3 years, and the goal of doing this Grand Tour of Europe, so visiting many European countries, would to be broaden the individual's education. It would also mark the end of childhood, so they're allowed to travel without the overseeing of their parents, and it is also to acquire social graces. So you can see here partaking in a sort of parlour activity where social customs were developed. Although not the initial goal, pleasure and entertainment became very important, so people would seek to travel to areas which were known for their fun and games. And people would travel with a large entourage. So an aristocrat, a wealthy young aristocrat, would travel with a large entourage, including their servants, tutors, mentors, proteges, and coachmen. And although it wasn't the primary goal, as you can see pictured here, this young gentleman is probably looking for a potential wife. And it was quite common for young males to travel around Europe and find a wife from a different country. And so that was definitely something that influenced modern tourism. And as we move into the 19th century, there were some significant technological developments that allowed tourism to change. The first being the development of the railway system in Europe. So because we had this large railway network, you can see all of the black lines are the 19th century railway network around Europe, it was much easier and much or less expensive for people to travel. So, of course, along with reduced costs, they also had the benefits of increased speed, so it was much faster to get around Europe, and they had increased comfort. Okay, so they wouldn't be travelling for days on end to get from France to Italy. It wouldn't take that long, and it was much more comfortable, and it didn't cost as much money. So the development of the railway system was really important in shaping how tourism looks today. It also led to the development of day trips and short stay trips. So prior to the development of this railway network, people would usually stay for months on end because it took them so long and so much effort to get there. With the invention of the railway system, people would stay for day trips or short stay trips, and that's where that sort of travel eventuated. We also had steamships that allowed this to happen, and they were developed in the 19th century as well. So there was access to areas that weren't previously accessible because it was too hard to get there. So with the steamship, we also had a broadening of tourism. Something else that happened in the 19th century was the beginning of organised all-inclusive travel. So all-inclusive travel is where your accommodation, your travel costs, your food, your entertainment are included in one fee. And that actually began in the 1840s. And this allowed not only the aristocracy to tour, but the middle class began touring as well. So up until this point, only the very, very wealthy could tour. But with the beginning of all-inclusive travel in the 1840s, we start to see that tourism becomes something that people in the middle class can afford. The last area that we're going to have a look at is contemporary tourism, or what tourism is like for us today, and how it has come from railway travel in Europe to what we know it as today. So one of the key points that has changed travel is economic growth. So thanks to increased trade between countries, We have people who are able to afford travel much more, so we often see many different types of people going on holidays rather than just those who are wealthy, like it was in the ancient and classical times. Of course, we've also had developments in air travel, so it's easier and faster to get to where we want to go. So obviously back in the 1800s, it wasn't possible to take a trip from England to Australia unless you wanted to spend 7 months on a steamship. But thanks to the increased ability to move around with speed due to the development of aircraft, obviously it's a lot easier for people to travel. Something that's come about recently is luxury air travel. So pictured here is the Singapore Airlines first class cabin on the Airbus A380. And so air travel is no longer just a process of getting somewhere, but it's actually an experience. Just a side note, if you do want to rent one of these cabins, it's about $11,000 one way from here in Australia to Europe. Another development is the opening up of new destinations. So previously we've mainly talked about tourism in Europe and maybe a little bit of Africa, but now we have many more destinations that we are able to visit. So of course people can visit Australia. Asia is also open to tourism. All of Africa basically is open to tourism, and the newest place that people are interested in is the Middle East, in particular Dubai, Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. They've spent a lot of money turning these vast deserts into basically tourist paradise. We've also got new types of holidays or new types of tourism. There are many different types of tourism that people can undertake. They can take backpacking holidays, which are sort of on a budget, sleeping rough, eating cheap, but getting around and seeing many places. You've also got the all-inclusive resort, so you can head to places like Fiji, Mexico, the Bahamas, and you can pay one fee and you can eat as much as you want, you can drink as much as you want, sleep, undertake activities, and it's all included in one fee. We've also got the development of volunteering holidays, so you can volunteer to travel to Southeast Asia or poorer parts of Africa, and you can actually, as part of your holiday, volunteer in some of these poorer communities. So you can do vaccination programs, you can build structures, you can build homes, and that is definitely a new type of travel that has come about in the past 20 years or so. Another type that we have is ecotourism, so people are becoming increasingly concerned about the environment, and you can actually go and be conscious of your footprint in the environment and undertake ecotourism. Another type of tourism that sprung up is sort of the luxury safari. So you can go stay in these luxury tents. In Africa, you can pay a lot of money to spend your time in these luxury tents. You receive, food from 5-star chefs, and then you venture out of your tent guided by tours to, experience the African wild as well. So I hope you have a better understanding after watching this video of how tourism began and how it's changed over the years. So I think the key point to take out of this video is that although for much of our time here on Earth, so from ancient time to about the 16th century, travel was reserved for the very wealthy. However, technological developments such as the development of railway networks, of steamships, and of course with air travel, we are able to access travel much more easily, which means that travel has moved from something that was exclusively for the wealthy for something that everybody can manage these days.